Imagine you're retiring. You did everything the system asked. You worked for 40 years. You paid your taxes. You sat in traffic long enough to memorize the back of strangers' bumpers. You made responsible choices. You delayed pleasure. You endured the slow grind that people call being an adult because you believed there was a finish line. And at the end of it, you bought your slice of the Florida dream. A small beachfront condo in St. Petersburg. Nothing obscene, just peace. Ocean breeze. Pastel sunsets that look like someone spilled sherbet across the sky. You sit on the balcony with a margarita and tell yourself, I finally made it. Then you open your mail. There's a notice from your homeowners association. The tone is polite, corporate, almost board-like it's announcing a change in pool hours. Except it's not. Your HOA fee isn't going up a little, it's tripling. From $600 a month to $2,000 a month. And attached to it is something even worse. A $50,000 special assessment due in 60 days to fix a concrete foundation you didn't even know was cracked. You read it twice because your brain rejects it the way the body rejects poison. You are not being evicted by a bank. You are being evicted by the math of your own building. Welcome to Florida in 2026. Because the Sunshine State's housing market isn't simply cooling off, it isn't just doing the normal real estate thing. Rates go up, prices flatten, buyers breathe again. This is different. What the data and the lived reality are suggesting is that Florida real estate is starting to fracture under the combined weight of climate risk, legislative panic, and an insurance market that functions less like a safety net and more like a casino where the house keeps changing the rules. And here's the uncomfortable part. This crisis isn't being driven by one big crash event like 2008. It's being driven by carrying costs, the hidden monthly expenses that don't show up in the Zillow screenshot people send their friends. In Florida, in 2026, you don't just buy a home. You buy a stream of future obligations that can mutate overnight. HOA reserves, special assessments, property tax resets, homeowners insurance shocks, flood insurance glide paths, sewer conversion mandates, stormwater fees, maintenance inflation, and a climate that doesn't negotiate. It's death by 1,000 invoices. Today, we're going to look under the hood of the most chaotic real estate market in America. We're going to do it mechanically, not with vibes, not with political slogans, not with the usual Florida is doomed or Florida is booming hot takes. We're going to break down why the condo market is bleeding out and how one tragic collapse rewired Florida law forever. Why inventory is rising, but prices aren't collapsing in a clean, satisfying way because the market is stuck in a paralyzing standoff. Why the insurance system is the real interest rate of Florida, and how it's quietly destroying purchasing power even when officials claim the crisis is stabilizing. Why Florida's population story is flipping, with workers and young professionals increasingly squeezed out while cash-heavy wealth moves in. And why the physical geology of the state itself pours limestone, rising water tables, and salt intrusion creates a hard ceiling no amount of optimism can simply bulldoze away. The question isn't just crash or reset. The deeper question is, can Florida remain a middle-class dream when the cost of simply existing on the peninsula keeps compounding? Because when carrying costs explode, housing doesn't just become expensive. Housing becomes unfinanceable. And once something becomes unfinanceable, prices don't need a dramatic crash to destroy wealth. Liquidity vanishes. Buyers disappear. Sellers become trapped. The market turns into a museum full of listings nobody can touch. So let's start where the fracture is most visible. 1. The Great Condo Collapse and the Ghost of Surfside. If you want to understand why Florida housing is breaking right now, you have to start with the bloodbath happening inside the condominium sector. Because condos aren't just a Florida lifestyle choice. They are a financial structure. They are a collective agreement between strangers to maintain a shared concrete organism for decades, with every incentive to underfund the future because humans are not built to feel tomorrow's pain today. And in Florida, that incentive was legally amplified for years. To understand why, we have to travel back to a night that still haunts the state's real estate psychology. June 2021. Champlain Towers South in Surfside, 12 stories of beachfront confidence collapsed into rubble in the middle of the night. 98 people died. It wasn't a market event, wasn't a downturn. It was pure tragedy. The kind that makes a state look in the mirror and realize its systems were built on denial. But the investigations that followed revealed something darker than corrosion or salt air. They revealed a financial reality. The building needed major repairs, millions of dollars worth, and the repairs were delayed. Not because nobody knew, but because nobody wanted to pay. That is the condo curse in one sentence. Everyone agrees the roof will eventually fail, but nobody wants to fund it while they're still alive to write the check. And Florida, for decades, allowed an escape hatch that turned this curse into an actual mechanism. Condo associations could vote to waive reserve funding. Here's what that means in plain English. In a healthy HOA, a portion of your monthly dues goes into reserves of piggy bank for future repairs. Roof replacement, elevator replacement, concrete restoration, seawall reinforcement, waterproofing, structural maintenance. The boring, unsexy things that keep a building from becoming a tomb. But in Florida's old regime, boards could simply hold a vote and say, let's not fund reserves this year, which kept monthly fees low, while quietly borrowing from the future. It was deferred maintenance as a lifestyle. A state-sanctioned Ponzi scheme where the returns were cheap HOA dues today and the exit strategy was to sell. Before the bill arrived, Surfside ended the illusion. Because once a building falls, you can't pretend the future is optional anymore. The legislature panicked rightfully and, in 2022, passed Senate Bill 4D, mandating structural integrity reserve studies for condos of 3 stories or more, and outlawing the old habit of waiving reserves for critical structural components. The grace period began expiring as the state rolled deeper into the mid-2020s, and that is where the 2026 crisis begins. Because a law can be morally correct and still be financially catastrophic, public safety demanded that these buildings stop gambling with gravity. But mathematically, forcing associations to catch up on decades of neglected maintenance is like demanding someone pay 30 years of missed mortgage payments in one afternoon. And that bill doesn't go to the market. It goes to the unit owners. Which is why the Florida Dream is now arriving with a second envelope heavy, official, and stamped with your name. In the next section, we'll follow the chain reaction, how Surfside created a new legal regime, how HOA fees and special assessments are exploding, how buyers and lenders are reacting, and why older coastal condos are turning into frozen assets, listed, discounted, and still unsellable. Because when your monthly HOA starts looking like a second mortgage, the market doesn't cool, it breaks. Surfside didn't just collapse a building, it collapsed a long-standing Florida habit, pretending time and salt air could be negotiated with optimism. For decades, the condo market ran on a quiet, unspoken bargain. People bought into the coastal dream because the monthly costs looked manageable, especially for retirees on fixed income. The building might be old. The elevators might groan. The concrete might flake a little. But the HOA dues were reasonable, and if something big happened, well, you dealt with it later. And later was always someone else's problem. That's the psychological engine behind deferred maintenance. It's not evil, it's human. Most people can't emotionally price in a roof replacement 20 years from now, so they can barely price in next month's groceries. So when the HOA board offers a choice, pay more now for reserves, or pay less now and hope for the best, many communities, especially older ones, choose the illusion. Florida's old legal structure made that illusion easy. Reserve funds, those boring, essential savings accounts for future repairs, could be waived with a simple vote. That meant a building could function like a financial mirage. Low dues, aka apparent affordability, and a hidden liability slowly growing in the bones of the structure. Surfside turned that hidden liability into a public fear. And fear is a powerful legislator. In the aftermath, Florida passed Senate Bill 4D. The headlines made it sound like a technical fix. But the mechanics were revolutionary. Structural integrity reserve studies, mandatory inspections, and most importantly restrictions on waiving reserves for critical structural components. In plain terms, the state told condo associations, you don't get to vote gravity away anymore. Now, let's steelman this. The best argument for the law is obvious and hard to refute. If you allow high-rise buildings to deteriorate financially and structurally, people die. Public safety is not optional. A government that refuses to intervene after Surfside is not a pro-market government. It's negligent, So yes, this was a necessary correction. But here's the part that headlines don't capture. A necessary correction can still feel like a financial execution for current owners. Because when you outlaw deferred maintenance, you don't magically erase the decades of decay. You reveal it. And once you reveal it, you have to pay for it. Immediately. Not in 20 years. Now, Florida has an enormous condo stock, and a huge portion of it is old, especially in coastal zones where salt air, humidity, and storm exposure chew through concrete and rebar like termites through wood. That means many associations are facing reserve requirements and repair demands that are not incremental. They are explosive. So what happens when a building that has been underfunding reserves for 15 or 20 years is suddenly forced to fully fund them? The monthly HOA dues go vertical. You start seeing dues that look like a second mortgage: $1,500, $2,000, $3,000 a month in some older coastal buildings, especially those now flagged for structural repair and restoration. And then come the special assessments, the one-time bills that arrive like a guillotine: $20,000, $40,000, $50,000, sometimes far more. Demanded on a fixed deadline because engineering work doesn't wait for your retirement check. This is how a condo turns from affordable retirement paradise into a trap. Let's make it personal, because this is where the crisis stops being a spreadsheet and becomes a story you can feel. Imagine you're an 8-year-old widow living on Social Security and a modest pension. You bought your condo years ago. You paid it off. You believed you were finally safe from monthly debt. Then your HOA doubles. Your building issues a $50,000 assessment. You don't have that cash. You don't have that income. And your lender doesn't care, because you're not dealing with a lender. You're dealing with a collective financial obligation enforced by the association. So you do the only rational thing. You list the condo for sale. But here is where Florida's mechanics turn cruel. Buyers in 2026 aren't dumb. They've seen Surfside. They've seen the new laws. They know older buildings are walking into mandatory studies, inspections, and repair cycles. So they demand transparency. They ask about reserves. They ask about reserve studies. They ask about upcoming assessments. They ask about engineering reports. They ask how much deferred maintenance has been priced in. And when a buyer sees a $2,500 HOA fee, something happens that most sellers don't understand until it's too late. The mortgage lender calculates the buyer's DTI, debt-to-income ratio. HOA dues count like debt. High HOA dues can make a buyer unfinanceable, so the lender laughs the deal out of the room. Not literally, but the spreadsheet does. The buyer can't qualify. The transaction dies, and that's how you get the condo freeze. A market where listings rise, price cuts appear, but sales do not clear. Inventory piles up. Days on market stretch 90 days, 120 days, longer in certain pockets. Sellers start cutting prices 10%, 15%, not because they want to, but because the carrying costs are crushing and they need to escape. Yet even with price cuts, buyers hesitate because the real price isn't the sticker price, it's the monthly burn. A condo can drop from $400,000 to $330,000 and still be unaffordable if the HOA is $2,500 a month. This is why Florida's condo crisis doesn't look like 2008. In 2008, the crisis was about credit quality's subprime loans, adjustable rates, default cascades. In Florida 2026, the crisis is about structural expenses becoming visible. It's an affordability crisis driven by forced repair reality, not just interest rates. And then the ecosystem responds. Developers begin circling. Because when a distressed association can't collect assessments, the building's financial structure weakens. Delinquencies rise. Deferred repairs become mandated repairs. The association can end up in receivership or bankruptcy-like scenarios. That's when a developer, with capital and patience, can swoop in. They buy out units at discounts. They acquire the building when owners are desperate. Then they demolish and rebuild into luxury. This is not conspiracy. It's Darwinism. It's what happens when an asset class becomes too expensive for its intended demographic. The market reassigns the land to a wealthier buyer. Which means the old Florida dream, the cheap coastal retirement condo, doesn't just fade. It gets regulated and priced out of existence, and that's only the first fracture. Because even if you avoid condos entirely by a single-family home, inland you still face the second great engine of Florida: housing instability, insurance. And insurance in Florida is not a minor line item. In 2026, it behaves like a second property tax, and sometimes a second mortgage. In the next section, we'll open the insurance machine. Tort reform, citizens' shrinking policy count, why stabilization can still be suffocation, and how reinsurance costs turn Florida into a state where middle-class buyers hit a wall even when sellers refuse to lower prices. Because the market isn't just about what homes cost, it's about what they cost to keep. Imagine you're a young professional couple moving from Ohio to Tampa. You've been responsible. You've saved your down payment. You avoided the worst consumer debt traps. You finally feel like you're stepping into adulthood the way your parents did by buying a home. You find a clean 3-bedroom built in the mid-1990s. Nothing extravagant, just a normal house in a normal neighborhood. The asking price is $450,000. You lock in your mortgage rate. You start picturing furniture. You text your parents screenshots like it's a victory. Then, 3 days before closing, your lender calls. Your loan is dead. Not because you lost your job. It's not because your credit score changed. Not because the appraisal failed. It's because your insurance quote came back. And it came back so high that your debt-to-income ratio no longer qualifies. Welcome to the real Florida housing market in 2026, the market that doesn't break at the sale price. It breaks at the monthly carrying cost. To understand why Florida is stuck in a paralyzing standoff right now, we have to talk about the insurance market. And here's where nuance matters, because headlines can be deceiving. You'll see articles that suggest the crisis is over, that reforms worked, that rates are coming down. And technically, those stories aren't entirely wrong. But they miss the crucial detail. Florida's insurance market can stabilize at an altitude where normal humans cannot breathe. Let's steelman the optimistic argument first. In 2022 and 2023, Florida passed sweeping tort reforms aimed at shutting down a system that had turned homeowner claims into a litigation factory. For years, Florida had a bizarre statistical profile. It represented a relatively small share of national homeowner claims, but an enormous share of homeowner insurance lawsuits. The state became a legal battlefield. Assignment of benefits, loopholes, and one-way attorney fees created incentives for aggressive litigation. Insurers bled. Smaller carriers collapsed. Premiums climbed. Citizens, the state-backed insurer of last resorts, wailed dangerously because private insurers fled. Then the reforms came. And the numbers, on paper, began to improve. Citizens' policy count fell dramatically from its peak. Citizens even announced an average rate decrease for 2026. Private insurers began returning, cautiously, like animals emerging after a wildfire. So, if you only look at the institutional markers, you might say, crisis solved. But here is the dark irony. If an airplane stops falling and stabilizes at 30,000 feet, that's technically stability. But if you step outside, you still die, because there is no oxygen. That's Florida insurance in 2026. Stabilized, yes, but stabilized at a premium level that is still suffocating the middle class. Back in 2019, the average annual cost of homeowners insurance in Florida was under $2,000 for many standard profiles. Fast forward to the mid-2020s, and depending on county, replacement cost and mitigation features, average premiums are often quoted in the mid-thousands per year. With coastal and higher-risk zones seeing numbers that feel like satire: $7,000, $8,000, $10,000 a year, and beyond for certain properties. So yes, an 8% rate decrease is nice. But an 8% discount on a number that already doubled or tripled since 2019 is not relief. It's a discount on pain. To understand why the floor is so high, you need to understand the invisible instrument that sits behind Florida's insurance premiums like a shadow government: reinsurance. Reinsurance is insurance for insurance companies. Because Florida insurers don't just fear normal losses, they fear catastrophe. One major hurricane can generate billions in claims overnight. No small regional insurer can hold that kind of money in a checking account. So they buy coverage from global reinsurance giants, often based in London, Bermuda, Switzerland, entities that care less about Florida politics and more about math, probabilities, and global capital costs. Reinsurers price risk based on variables that are moving in the wrong direction: the increasing frequency and cost of billion-dollar weather events, the inflation of building materials, lumber, copper, concrete, labor, the rising replacement cost of roofs and structural repairs, the exposure concentration, millions of properties packed into hurricane zones. If reinsurance becomes more expensive, primary insurers pass the cost directly to homeowners. It's not optional. It's the core fuel of the industry. Reinsurance is the oxygen tank. If it costs more, you pay more. And here's the part most homeowners don't see. Even if Florida fixes its lawsuit culture perfectly, it still has to buy reinsurance from global markets that are repricing climate and catastrophe risk. You can reform the courts. You cannot legislate the Atlantic Ocean into being cheaper. Now let's connect this to the housing market. Banks don't underwrite housing based on vibes. They underwrite based on PITI principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. Your monthly mortgage payment is not just your mortgage payment. It's the total burn rate of owning the property. And lenders have strict rules about what percentage of your income can go toward that burn rate. So in Florida, insurance acts like an interest rate on top of your interest rate, a hidden rate, a private tax, a monthly tribute. Back to our Ohio couple. Mortgage rates are hovering around the mid-6% range. Property taxes are reassessed at the new purchase price, so taxes rise. And then insurance comes in at $600 a month, $700 a month, sometimes more. The lender runs the numbers and says, no, not because you're irresponsible, because the state's risk pricing has devoured your borrowing capacity. This is how a market breaks without prices crashing instantly. The buyer pool shrinks, not because people don't want to buy, but because fewer people can qualify. Meanwhile, Solaire still anchored to the pandemic era. Boom refused to accept lower prices because they remember their neighbor selling for $500,000. In 2022, they think that peak is the real value of their home. Emotionally, they live in the past. So you get a stalemate. Buyers can't finance the numbers. Sellers won't accept the new reality. Listings sit. Days on market expand. Inventory piles up, but prices don't collapse cleanly because many owners are locked into low-rate mortgages and can afford to wait. It's a slow-motion freeze rather than a dramatic crash. And this is why Florida housing feels like it's breaking in a weird, paralyzing way. The market isn't moving. And when real estate stops moving, a state like Florida built on growth, migration, and transaction velocities starts to cannibalize itself. Which brings us to the next fracture, and it's more sinister because it doesn't show up immediately on Redfin charts. The demographic U-turn. Florida isn't just a place. It's a service economy powered by human labor, tourism, hospitality, healthcare, construction, elder care. The state needs nurses, teachers, roofers, HVAC, techs, and yes, bartenders. But those workers are now being priced out of the very communities they keep functioning. In the next section, we'll look at the migration data, the halfback phenomenon, the quiet exodus of young professionals, and why a housing market can look strong while the workforce underneath it drains away. Because a state can survive expensive houses, it cannot survive when the people who run it can no longer afford to live there. Florida has always sold itself as a kind of economic magic trick. No state income tax. Warm weather, beaches, retirement paradise. A place where you could trade snow for sunshine and, somehow, trade financial pressure for freedom. For years, the formula seemed unstoppable. People poured in, companies followed, housing surged. The state became a magnet, especially during the pandemic era when migration turned into a stampede. But here's the deeper truth of any place built on migration. It only works if the people who arrive can afford to stay, and the people who keep the lights on can afford to exist. In 2026, Florida is discovering the difference between growth and sustainability, because the demographic story is flipping. And when a housing market's demographic engine flips, you don't just get a price correction. You get an ecosystem failure. 3. The demographic U-turn. When the Sunshine State runs out of bartenders. Picture a high-end steakhouse in Naples. It's early evening. Wealthy retirees and finance transplants sit under warm lighting, ready to drop $300 on a tomahawk ribeye and a bottle of wine. But the restaurant is half empty and still has a 2-hour wait. It's not because demand is high, because labor is missing. When the server finally arrives, they look exhausted 6 tables at once, sweat breaking through their shirt. You ask the manager what's happening, and he gives you a stare that feels less like customer service and more like confession. We can't find anyone to work. Why? Because the person who is supposed to serve you cannot afford to live within 50 miles of the restaurant. This is the service economy paradox of Florida in 2026. The state is attracting cash-heavy wealth while quietly bleeding out the middle-class workforce that makes that wealth's lifestyle possible. Now, on paper, Florida can still look strong. GDP is large. Job growth exists. Certain industries keep expanding. The wealthy are still coming in. Luxury markets still trade. Private jets still land. Look under the hood migration data, cost of living surveys, and workforce affordability, and the engine block starts to crack. A service economy requires people, not just investors, not just retirees, people who work. And those people have a breaking point. A young nurse in Orlando, a teacher in Tampa, a construction worker in Fort Myers. These aren't luxury jobs, but they're essential jobs. 5 years ago, someone in these roles could plausibly rent decently, save slowly, maybe buy a starter home. In 2026, that same person faces a new wall. Rents inflated, car insurance high, groceries higher, mortgage rates elevated, and homeowners insurance acting like a second mortgage. The burden isn't just the house price, it's the cost of carrying the house. So they vote with their feet. This is where Florida's booming narrative turns into a darker reality. The state is becoming less affordable to the exact demographic needed to keep it functioning. And parallel to the worker squeeze, another group is quietly reconsidering the Florida dream: retirees themselves. Because the sunshine looks different after your roof gets ripped off, and the insurance quote comes back like a ransom note. This is the halfback phenomenon, the retiree migration cycle, where people move all the way down to Florida. Then, after a few years of hurricane risk, special assessments, and insurance shocks, they move halfway back north into the Carolinas, Tennessee, Georgia, places that still offer mild winters without the same volatility in coastal risk pricing. So Florida's inflow increasingly concentrates in the wealthy, the cash buyers, the self-insures people who do not depend on local wages. Meanwhile, the outflow grows among working-age residents and cost-sensitive retirees. That creates a structural imbalance. Florida becomes a state of high-end property and missing labor, a place where the houses are expensive, but the human infrastructure is thinning. And now we add the invisible tax that accelerates this process, one that doesn't care about politics or optimism: flood risk. For the subsidized swamp, math problem, and risk rating 2.0. Imagine you own a modest home in Cape Coral. You're not a millionaire. You're not on the beach. You're inland enough that you thought the flood talk was for other people. Your flood insurance renews. Last year, it was $800. This year, it's $944, an 18% increase. Annoying, but you pay it. Next year, it rises again and again. You call your agent furious, asking when this ends. They look at your file and say something that feels like a trap disguised as policy. The government's new risk model says your true premium is $6,500, so it will keep rising by 18% each year until it reaches that number. Welcome to the mechanics of FEMA's Risk Rating 2.0. For decades, the National Flood Insurance Program operated on blunt maps and broad categories. It often mispriced risk and crucially subsidized it. Not always intentionally, but functionally. People built in flood-prone zones with premiums that didn't reflect true exposure. Because the program spread costs across taxpayers and policyholders in ways that kept the dream alive. But the dream was expensive. The NFIP accumulated massive losses over time. Rebuilding the same areas after repeated storms is not insurance in the traditional sense. It's reconstruction funding with paperwork. So FEMA updated the model. Risk Rating 2.0 uses more granular data: elevation, proximity to water, rainfall patterns, rebuild cost. It is more accurate, and accuracy has a price. Here's the cruel part. FEMA often caps how fast premiums can rise for many primary residents as around 18% per year. Politicians sell this as consumer protection. But if you understand compound growth, you realize it's a glide path to pain, not a shield. An 18% annual increase repeated for years isn't gradual relief. It's a slow-motion execution. And this changes real estate valuation in a way Zillow can't show. When a buyer looks at a home requiring flood insurance, the relevant number isn't what the seller pays this year. It's what the buyer will pay in 5 years. Lenders understand that. Underwriters understand that. So flood insurance becomes a hidden liability that reduces financing eligibility and suppresses future demand. Some homeowners respond in a way that should terrify any economist. They drop flood insurance once the mortgage is paid off because lenders can't force it anymore. They go bare. They self-insure against nature. That seems rational in the moment till a major storm hits and millions in wealth evaporate with no insurance backstop. And now, the most brutal reality of all. Florida's risk isn't only water coming from outside. It's water rising from below. The state is a peninsula built on porous limestone. It behaves less like a solid foundation and more like a rigid sponge. That means seawalls and pumps can work on streets and surfaces, but water can still travel through the ground, rising through storm drains, bubbling up from below. You can lock the front door. The ocean comes in through the floor. Which means the climate adaptation costs are not one-time. They're recurring. Roads get raised. Stormwater systems get upgraded. Sewer lines get expanded. Pumping infrastructure grows. Every adaptation is another bill. And those bills, stormwater fees, sewer connection mandates, utility hikes, ultimately get passed to homeowners. This is the part that turns a housing market slowdown into something more structural. Florida isn't just dealing with interest rates. It's dealing with compounding risk costs that behave like a new form of taxation. And the middle class is the shock absorber. Now we arrive at a pivotal question. If costs are rising, buyers are shrinking. Workers are leaving, and risk is being repriced. Why? Haven't prices already collapsed? Because another force has been quietly propping up the market for years. Wall Street, institutional investors. And in 2026, the most underreported shift is that the smart money may be heading for the exits. In the next section, we'll look at the institutional investor reversal, cap rate math, why treasuries are suddenly more attractive than hurricane rentals, and how big investors leaving removes a price floor at the exact moment retail buyers are paralyzed. Because when the safety net disappears, the fall gets faster. Imagine you're a risk analyst at a large private equity firm in Manhattan. You don't care about Florida sunsets. You've never sipped a margarita on a balcony in St. Petersburg. You've never worried about a condo assessment letter. You care about one thing, the spreadsheet. Your firm owns thousands of single-family rental homes scattered across Tampa, Orlando, and Jacksonville. For years, Florida was a golden play. Cheap borrowing, rapid population growth, easy rent increases, asset prices rising faster than inflation. It was the perfect institutional story. Buy homes, raise rent, refinance, repeat. Then 2026 arrives, and the cells on your spreadsheet start flashing red. Insurance costs are exploding. Property taxes are resetting higher. Maintenance inflation is brutal. Sewer and infrastructure assessments are creeping in. Rent growth is slowing because the local workforce is squeezed. And hurricane risk, once priced like a manageable nuisance, now looks like a variable that can vaporize an entire year's returns overnight. You walk into the portfolio manager's office and say the sentence nobody expected to hear in the Sunshine State. We need to sell Florida. This is one of the most important shifts happening beneath the headlines. For years, the narrative was, Wall Street is buying your neighborhood. And yes, in many markets, large investors did buy. They became a major buyer class. They showed up with cash offers and industrial-scale operations. They helped turn housing into a financial product. But the key question for 2026 is not whether they bought, it's whether they are staying. Because Florida's housing market was not just fueled by retirees and families. It was also supported by an invisible price floor, institutional demand. And when institutions become net sellers, the floor becomes a trapdoor. 6. The institutional exodus. Why the math stopped working. Institutional real estate investing isn't emotional. It's not a lifestyle. It's not dream building. It's cap rate math. A capitalization rate is simple: the net operating income of a property divided by its price. In a world of low interest rates, a 4% or 5% cap rate looked attractive, especially if rents were rising fast and borrowing was cheap. But now run the 2026 Florida reality through that formula. The property's value rose during the boom, but the income didn't rise enough to match the costs. Expenses, especially insurance, have decoupled from normal reality. Property taxes increase. Maintenance costs inflate. Vacancy risk rises if workers leave. And the big one, rent increases are no longer unlimited because the middle class is running out of oxygen. So net operating income falls. Cap rates compress. And then the risk-free alternative becomes irresistible. Why would an institution deal with hurricanes, lawsuits, and tenant turnover for a 3% yield when U.S. Treasury bonds can offer a comparable yield with zero roof repairs and no storm surge? When the risk-free rate rises, everything reprices, and Florida's landlord math breaks. Now, nuance matters. Most investor-owned homes are still held by small landlords, people with 1 to 5 properties. But the giant institutions, the ones with thousands of homes, tend to be more sensitive to macro shifts. They can move faster. They can unload in volume. They don't need to believe in the market. They just need to protect returns. And when they turn into sellers, the market absorbs a new kind of inventory: motivated, large-scale inventory. That is how slow markets become fast markets. Because retail buyers, the normal family buyers, are already paralyzed by mortgage rates and insurance quotes. So if big sellers dump supply into a frozen buyer pool, basic economics does what it always does. Prices start bending downward. But Florida's market still doesn't collapse neatly. And this brings us to the most important psychological mechanic of the entire 2026 standoff: the golden handcuffs. 7. The golden handcuffs. Why sellers are trapped. Imagine you bought your home in 2021. You locked in a 2.9% mortgage. You're sitting on paper equity because prices rose. On Zillow, you look rich. In real life, you're trapped. Because to move, you would have to give up your cheap debt and replace it with expensive debt. You'd go from 2.9% to 6% plus. And in Florida, moving often resets your property tax basis upward, increasing taxes. Insurance on a new property might be far higher. HOA or special assessments might be lurking. The monthly payment shock becomes massive. So even if you made money on paper, you can't afford to leave your own house. This is why inventory can rise while prices don't instantly crash. Many homeowners don't have to sell. They can wait. Their mortgage is cheap. Their payment is manageable. So the market becomes a stalemate. Sellers anchor to 2022 peak pricing and refuse to cut aggressively. Buyers can't qualify or won't accept the carrying costs. Transactions collapse. Days on market stretch. Price reductions happen, but slowly, reluctantly, painfully. It's not a crash. It's sclerosis. But sclerosis can still kill the organism, just slower. And then builders enter like a separate species: hate builders and the cannibal market. Corporate home builders have one thing that normal sellers don't: they can buy down mortgage rates through in-house financing incentives. So even if a resale home is listed at $500,000, a builder down the street can offer a new build at $480,000 with a subsidized 4.99% rate and closing cost credits. For a buyer, monthly payment matters more than purchase price. So builders capture the remaining qualified buyers. Resale sellers get starved. Inventory grows. The market fractures into two realities: incentivized new builds moving and frozen resales sitting. The verdict: crash or reset. So what is Florida in 2026? A crash or a reset? The honest answer is that it's not likely to be one cinematic collapse like 2008, not across the whole state at once. It's more like a localized reset, unfolding in layers. Older coastal condos facing reserve mandates and structural repairs may experience dramatic price compression and liquidity collapse. Single-family homes in high insurance and flood risk zones may see valuation pressure as carrying costs act like a permanent tax. Luxury markets may remain resilient because cash buyers can ignore financing rules and self-insure. Working-class areas may hollow out as labor leaves and service industries strain. Municipal budgets may tighten if transaction volume stays low, forcing higher fees or degraded services feeding back into desirability and property values. This is the key insight. Florida's housing market is not failing because people don't want Florida. It's failing because Florida is becoming a place where the cost of admission and maintenance is too high for the people who make Florida function. And once that happens, real estate becomes less like an investment and more like a subscription. You don't own a home, you subscribe to risk. HOA dues, insurance premiums, flood glide paths, infrastructure assessments, stormwater fees, all compounding, all unpredictable. And that is why, for many middle-class buyers and retirees, Florida is starting to feel like a dream with fine print. In the 20th century, Florida was the affordable escape. In the 2020s, Florida is becoming a high-cost, high-volatility asset class, a beautiful one, a seductive one, but an asset class nonetheless. So if you're thinking about buying in Florida or retiring there or keeping that older coastal condo, just look at the sticker price. Look at the carrying costs. Look at the reserve studies. Look at the insurance quotes. Look at the flood zone glide path. Look at the infrastructure mandates. Because in 2026, the real risk isn't that Florida homes drop 30% overnight. The real risk is that you wake up one morning, open your mailbox, and discover that your home is still worth something on paper, but you can no longer afford to live inside it.